Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Talking Deals with David. Today, we're going to be talking about ESG and M&A. Christine, thanks for joining me for this. I know we've been talking about it for a couple months, and now it's here. So thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. I have been really looking forward to this because I know I'm just going to learn a ton from your experience of working with M&A deals and seeing how ESG plays out behind the scenes.
Wait, I thought I was supposed to be learning from you. So how is that? I
Yeah,
guess
well,
you
we
had
can
an
share.
ulterior. Okay, you had an ulterior motive, and
Yeah.
we're actually live on these things. Actually, Shelby, who helps produce these and does just a fantastic job putting these things together for me. She, we were on and we were talking about how some people on these LinkedIn lives have been using another service to actually post, I guess, pre-recorded ones, so they're not really live. And we were kind of talking about that. And then, Christine, you were having trouble logging on from your computer. And so you're
Mhm.
dialing in from your phone. So we have a little bit of a different look, but we were just on 30 seconds before we were live. So
Yep.
this is,
I I'm good to go. I'm fine with live.
yeah, it's great to be on live. And I think this is a really awesome topic because we could sort of bring, I guess, two different perspectives, although you have a lot of experience also in M&A deals and deals that you've been involved with companies that you've been at. So we have that background, but you really are very focused on the ESG side of the world and have been doing incredible things on your LinkedIn content, I think specifically geared to in-house lawyers and
Mhm.
people that are trying to get their arms around ESG and sort of being on the front edge of that as opposed to being more reactive. So what has your experience been in terms of thinking about ESG and also this M&A overlay?
Yeah, it's a great question. Right now, the focus on ESG, if you're in a company, it's really ramped up over the last year. This is in part due to regulatory changes. We saw the announcement from the SEC last year about proposing rules for climate disclosure. They are recently talking about human capital disclosures as well. So really moving more and more along these lines, which means as a company, you're thinking about, okay, how do I gather this data? How do I present this data? What does this mean for my business? Is it material? And those things, and that is in a public company space. And I think what private companies haven't yet realized is or a lot of private companies, is it's really going to impact them as well, because what you're going to see is the public companies being able to report in a certain way, and that growing into a market expectation where you'll have clients, private investors and so forth, asking you for the same information. So over the next 12 24 months, companies are really going to have to learn how to produce uh, incredible data on their ESG. And then naturally, the next question is, okay, how are you going to improve performance? Just like you report on your financials, how are you going to improve performance? So in an M&A context, as a buyer, you want to be thinking about those things in advance. Does the company that you're buying, do they have their arms around this? Can they provide you the data? If they can't, how hard is that going to be to integrate? And as a seller, you want to be able to make it easy. So already have this data, put it in your pitch deck and those kinds of things. So I think that's where I predict that's where the M&A market is going. But you, David, you do so many more transactions than I do. I'm curious, are you seeing that on the ground?
Well, I think it's all great, and I think we're very aligned on that. I do think it's sort of a convergence of factors. I think it's the growing recognition that we are going to see, some mandatory ESG related disclosures in the U.S. And as you mentioned, it's at least for now sort of focused at the public company level. Although, as you also say, any companies that are sort of swept up in the value chain for one of those public
Mhm.
companies is going to find themselves kind of a recipient of, I assume, ESG related, climate related disclosure requests, diligence requests, and they're going to need to start thinking about that. But yeah, I think it's a very mixed. I was thinking about this last night, and I do think it's very mixed. I think, and I looked at some studies that some of the consulting firms, have been doing, and I think there are two ways to look at it. If you are doing an ESG sort of focused deal, you're in the energy sector and you're trying to divest some of your more carbon intense businesses and try to build out more renewable energy. Well, that deal by definition is ESG focused, obviously primarily on the E in ESG. And so of course, all of the kind of diligence and other factors that you would look at in sourcing a deal and documenting a deal is going to be front and center, because that's the purpose of it. And we're seeing a lot of that in divestitures where companies in energy or other sectors are looking to perhaps divest non-core assets or assets that are not consistent with their reported or their planned sustainability goals or ESG goals. So that's one side. The side that I'm more interested in, I think, is more the ESG conscious type M&A, where it's not a driver of the deal. It's just a factor that may have some impact on valuation, on diligence, on how you document the deal, how you integrate the business. And so I think there it's a mixed bag. I think there is some anecdotal, evidence that I've seen and that I've read that says, yeah, people are more ESG conscious in their deals. And even when it's not an ESG focused deal, they are thinking about how does this impact where I want to go with my business and what does it tell me? And I think, and we've talked about this, I think people that are not doing that are missing substantial value, and not just from avoiding risk. I think that's where a lot of people focused on ESG in the M&A world. It's like, find me all the problems so that I can make sure that I'm not missing something. Whereas I think a better way to look at it is sort of to flip the script a bit and say, yeah, I want to identify risks, of course, and I want to find ways to mitigate those risks. But really what I want to do is drive additional value into my business, the combined business. And I think being on the forefront of some of those ESG factors is going to give you a competitive advantage and better long-term value for shareholders. But again, that's sort of just an untested thesis. But I think we're going to see more of that in the rest of 2023, and as you say, going into 2024 and 2025.
Yeah, those are both, they're very different business cases with different thoughts that go around them. With divestitures, it's something my company has been through, is divesting a lot of coal assets and so forth to buy renewables. And the case in terms of reducing our carbon footprint there is really clear. And there's also a lot of questions around how long will coal continue to be used? What's the lifetime of those assets? But you do really have to think further about ESG factors when you're in those. So to make sure that you are, not having unintended effects on the community. If you're talking, for example, about closing down a coal site, what happens to the community around that? What do they do for labor and so forth? And there's a lot of, while companies are divesting, there's a lot of questions that come up around how are they doing it and are they doing it appropriately? So from a social context that shouldn't be forgotten. On the buy side or sell side in an ESG conscious deal, I think there's a couple of things. As you point out, there's risk management, and that revolves around, there's the carbon perspective, but I think there's also from a social perspective, you don't want to be buying human rights problems or labor problems, or even, it gets more complicated now with the geopolitics and the expectations around DEI. So are you buying a bad reputation there, or problems that could become a bad reputation? So those are, classic risk aspects to look at. But you're right. I advise any business to think about it in terms of opportunities. So if you have a great performance in this area, Do you have an opportunity to expand into a business line that you wouldn't have otherwise, could be profitable, will be growing? You're seeing, particularly, looking at what's coming down with the IRA in the United States, the money that's becoming available, that will be transformational for a lot of businesses. So is there upside there that may not be calculated, or that may be important for your business? There's the cultural piece, so you get to integration. That the integration is everything when you're doing a deal. Can your businesses coexist or blend together? And if you bring in an acquisition that has particular expertise around how it's managing its ESG, do you have an opportunity to learn from that, and for that acquisition to become a leader in your company in this sphere? So maybe it brings practices that are more mature than your own, and that can be a great vehicle for integration.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, I've done now maybe 2 or 3 of these live events talking about, why M&A deals fail miserably so often,
Mhm.
and the importance of integration, and other factors that go into that, including valuing a business properly, not
Mhm.
overpaying, which is all too common, especially in the environment that we were in last few
Yeah.
years. It's tempering a bit, but I do think I want to step back though a little bit, because I think, and maybe there's a difference between the U.S. and other parts of the world. I certainly see differences when you do a cross-border deal, where a lot of times European companies are surprised by the bit of chaotic environment, I think, that we have in the US on the ESG side. For one, it's just because people aren't sure exactly what it means. They understand, kind of the letters, um, but what does an ESG focus, or having an ESG sort of conscious M&A strategy, and not specific to just M&A, but in general, Christine, how do you think about ESG? What do those sort of letters mean to you?
Yeah. So, I mean, the letters, it's about non-financial performance is what ESG is at its heart. I think that's often misunderstood. It's misused, I would say, in the political dialogue that we have out, and it can be labeled a do-gooder piece, which really, when you look at what ESG is, it came out of both an investor and an insurance context, and trying to measure the long-term value of a company by thinking about some of these aspects. And so when you look at the environment piece, you're really usually looking at environment risk, and right now, climate is everything in there, because that is where our biggest environmental risk is. So that's why you see so much of the focus around ESG being on climate, because that's almost always the biggest risk. You do have businesses that are a bit different. Maybe you have heavy plastics or something along those lines that need to be addressed, single-use plastics, but by and large, it's emissions and so forth. And so, you want to be able to look at that from an ESG perspective and say, hey, for example, if your company's already set a net zero goal, what does it mean to incorporate the company that you're acquiring into that net zero goal? What kind of commitments do you have, or what regulations are going to be coming down in terms of your responsibility to report and reduce, and can that new company comply with it? From a social perspective, this is about people. It's about your people, your employees, your subcontractors, and so forth, as well as the communities that you operate in. And it's looking at, do you have a positive social impact or a negative social impact? And I think this is something that's been a part of business for longer than the climate considerations, and comes down into, do you have sound labor practices? Are you guarding against human rights issues? DEI has been a much bigger focus in there. But really, do you have positive social aspects? The piece there that's newer is a stakeholder management in the community, and really thinking, outside your employee base into how you're impacting the community around you. That's a more and more important piece, particularly as we're seeing a lot of activist litigation and so forth are putting pressure on large companies, at least, to be better in that area. Governance is critical, but it's also the one that's probably the most controlled. So governance is, how do you make decisions in your company? How do you have, your board, your committee set up? How do you have power distributed? Do you have good compliance practices in terms of anti-corruption and ethics policies and so forth? And this is really something, most companies have been dealing with at minimum since Sarbanes-Oxley and all the scandals we had in the early 2000s. And, certainly if you don't have your house order in order on governance, start there. Really, really basic, you have to have it, but most companies will have already gone over kind of that hurdle. And there's some new questions on, all right, within your governance program, how do you integrate the environmental and social aspects? Who makes decisions there? How you move them forward? How do you inform the board and so forth? Those are the three aspects, and it is about long-term value. One of the things that I've written about is kind of separating out sustainability from ESG. They definitely go better together. It's a lot easier to have a good ESG rating if you have a good sustainability plan, but they're not always the same. You have companies that might have a good ESG rating, but really not be sustainable from a climate perspective or some other perspective. So you need to kind of separate out the two and look at ESG as that non-financial value.
Yeah, well, boards, I mean, it's really a great, way to think about it, Christine. I think where I've seen, and maybe why the United States perhaps lags a bit, is, it's such a, it seems like such a complicated topic with so many different, strands that you can go down, that I think a lot of people just sort of get lost. They're not sure kind of where, to begin. And in the M&A world, I think that's definitely true. But I try to think about it, much more in a much more simple way, that most of the E and the S and the G are already part of, a typical M&A transaction. So everything from compliance with laws to thinking about environmental, issues that may come up in a particular transaction, we already have a framework, in an M&A deal to, deal with that. And we've encountered things like this before, like when dealing with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or dealing with supply chain issues that may come up in cross-border deals. So a lot of the framework that I think buyers or sellers, can use when they're thinking about M&A are really just already embedded in the process. It just has this different, phraseology around it. And I think for a lot of companies, it kind of, it brings in the political, context. It brings in the big social, factors. And you even will see people even today sort of saying, well, I can't consider ESG factors because I'm incorporated in Delaware, or which a lot of companies are, and you'll hear that even still. I've spent a long time trying to debunk that, because it's really a significant, myth, I think. ESG at its core, I mean, is, as you say, it's focused on how does our business survive for the long term and continue to be profitable. So in that sense, it's very closely linked, I think, to long-term shareholder value maximization, all the things that you sort of hear about and read about, particularly when you're, thinking about Delaware companies. But have you found that it's more challenging in the United States, perhaps, to get people thinking about, ESG, even in the more narrow context that I'm talking about? You've broadened it a bit, by talking about sustainability more generally. But did you have a similar perception compared to, people in France or Europe, other places around the world?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends on where else around the world. Certainly in Europe, what you see is a more regulated front on these topics, much more regulated. And so you see a higher level of maturity on these topics, and also to a higher level of uniformity and expectation. In the US, I think it does get confusing to look look at from abroad, because we are a nation as the United States, but we're also made up of all these individual states. So what's happening in California will be completely different from what's happening in Florida. California, you have really trying to push the envelope with regulations, and Florida trying to make ESG illegal. So it's there. It does create a whole different message that can be very difficult to absorb from abroad. Absolutely agree that a lot of ESG is baked in, and that people get very overwhelmed because it's a whole new terminology. It has a lot of different factors, but there are core elements. So like I was saying with governance, absolutely critical. Most companies already have it set up. So you need to I run the ethics programs. It's an ongoing work every year to have that governance, but it's already set up and running. A lot of the social aspects will already be set up. In terms of environment, of course, we have pollution controls and that kind of thing. Where I see the real difference makers are in a few places. So the geopolitical aspects have shifted significantly. We saw that with Russia in the Ukraine, and how quickly the Western world had to shut down business with Russia. I think that was a huge eye opener, and something that, as we're seeing a more tense geopolitical environment, companies need to be thinking about, do I want to be doing business in countries that have maybe not as much adherence to the rule of law or to international norms. That's a very real business long-term survival issue that needs to be considered. You're having, particularly in the U.S., a more heated political environment, particularly around DEI issues and other topics in the social area, where it's very different, because employees and stakeholders are putting pressure on companies to take a public stand on social issues in ways that just have not happened in the past. And so that's something that companies really have to stay aware of, and that's a changing dynamic. And then the third changing dynamic, and probably the biggest one, is the climate change factors. So there's a couple of reasons for that. One, it's the climate is heating up already. It's scientifically provable, and this decade is really the decade that's going to be a difference maker. So that's why you're seeing a lot of politicians talking about regulatory authorities and so forth, and these disclosures. And the other thing you're seeing happening is that it really has business impacts. It's the climate, depending on where you have assets, you could be having problems with assets becoming less valuable or unusable, depending on where your workforce is. Your workforce could be impacted by different areas. Certainly anything agricultural will be impacted. Then you also have the opportunity side, where if you're investing in no or low carbon alternatives, moving to efficient equipment, greening out your fleet, those kinds of things can have significant upside, particularly as governments are investing in them. And then finally, the competitive nature. So as companies adopt these promises around how they're performing in a climate context, they will be putting pressure across their supply chains. You will be getting questions from your clients. It will become, and it is already. I mean, I already get questionnaires all the time from our clients on our carbon performance, where we need to share that data, and it does become a competitive differentiator very quickly. So there's a lot in ESG that will already be baked into a deal 100%, and then there are these newer factors that I think people really need to consider.
Well, I think one way to think about it on the M&A side, especially when you're thinking about for sort of sourcing deals, is and this applies, I think, in M&A, generally, if you don't know where you are and where you want to go, then you have no chance of actually implementing an effective strategy for your business or for an M&A strategy. So I don't think it needs to be as complicated as people make it. So if you have a good sense of your own, business and your own goals around sustainability broadly or ESG factors more particularly, whether that's because you're being forced to do that, because of some of these, pending disclosure legislation if you're a public company, or if you're a private company that is in the value chain of some of these businesses, and you feel like I'm going to have to, grudgingly be dragged along. Even if that's the case, you have a perspective of where you want to go. And then you can start to think about how does an acquisition target then look to me?
Mhm.
And I think what you do then is kind of identify the material risks from an ESG perspective. But as I said, even more importantly, where are the opportunities on the ESG side? Whether that's building, acquiring new technology, people, the culture, that can help your combined business make further, inroads in ESG areas, or whether it's just making sure that the synergies and the expected financial returns that you want to get are realized. If you can start to think about those, and then I think you'll narrow down, where are the material areas that we need to focus on, and then you can build that in to your M&A strategy, what you're already doing, on all the different factors that go into deciding whether or not you do an M&A deal. But a lot of that comes down to having a good self-assessment, I guess, sort of being
Yeah.
introspective and understanding, who are we as a company? What are we trying to accomplish in the next, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years? And where do we need to add additional capacity or expertise, or maybe reallocate things that are not contributing, toward that ultimate, mission and endpoint. Once you know that, then I think it starts to fall a bit more into place. Not that it's, not still
Mhm.
challenging and has its burdens, but I think that helps. If you don't know that, then you're just adrift. And, these factors then are just overwhelming in some point in different directions. And, it can be very difficult. And that's where I think a lot of companies in the M&A world just forget about it. Unless it's a regulatory thing where somebody can point to a violation of a particular law, which we do look at in M&A, and there are representations in the agreement dealing with that. They just let that stay. But I know you're very, I think you're very data oriented. You understand the importance of sort of data in the ESG world. Um, are you seeing private companies working toward that, whether it's doing these, preparing for these questionnaires or other things? But how is data sort of impacting the way you think about ESG?
Yeah. Yeah, data is critical, and I recommend, I write on this a lot, any company who's just getting started in this area to start, gather a set of cross-functional leaders and think through what are the 2 or 3 issues that you need to move the needle on. Don't, boil the ocean at once. Pick 2 or 3, try to move the needle on those in, over the course of a year, and see how it looks. That's important to drive focus in any program, in any business. But once you have identified, okay, here are what we think that the key items are, data is the next step, because you don't really know where you stand. So if you're looking at climate, you need to look at what your footprint is, and I can tell you that is a complicated data collection, a task that's part of what my company does for clients day in day out. It can, depending on your complexity, take several months. It's definitely not a few day process, and you want to be right on that data, particularly if you are publicly disclosing it. So if you're publicly disclosing it, even if it's not in a public filing, if you're putting it on your website, if you're releasing a corporate sustainability report, if your executives are talking about it in the press, those numbers have to be right, and you have to be able to back them up. And that data will come from many different sources. So it'll come from energy bills. It'll come from looking at your assets and applying and plugging them into the climate protocol. It will come from collecting information from your suppliers. So you have to have an advanced data system for that kind of work. And then similarly, if you're looking at social issues, you have to be able to have data on employees, what's happening with employees, your subcontractors, how are they handling labor issues, your supply chain. The supply chain is really one of the stickiest areas when you get into ESG areas. It's also a very important risk area for you to be managing. And this geopolitical concern comes up over and over when you're looking at supply chain as well. So all of these are risks that are just good management to manage, and that's the interesting thing about the political debate. There have been study after study proving that businesses that have a strong ESG performance have a strong overall performance. And it shouldn't be surprising, because at the end of the day, this is just good management. It is managing risk and looking for opportunities. It may just be we have a different set of risks and opportunities than we have in the past.
Well,
David?
and it leads to the idea of an ESG premium that, you're
Yes.
seeing that more in the M&A world where, there's lots of factors that go into valuing a business. Take out, like, say, a public company target where kind of have a, regularly trading stock price. And so that sort of, sets the baseline for, valuing that business. But in a private business, there's all kinds of different factors that go into assessing what's the proper value for that business. And there's a lot of discussion. I've written a little bit about that, but a lot of discussion around, how do you reflect poor ESG ratings or performance? And on the other side, how do you give a benefit? And that can take different forms. I've been sort of in my mind viewing poor ESG performance as perhaps akin to deferring capital expenditures, which
Mm-hmm.
sometimes sellers will do.
Yep.
You won't spend the money to, repair the facilities or invest in your people or do the things that you need to do. And so when the buyer comes around, it's essentially saddled with a lot of these embedded costs, which then you're going to have to expend. So do you adjust for those costs in your deal model? Whether making specific adjustments for that, as a way of basically like increasing CapEx expenses or anticipated expenses, or do you adjust it in some other way through, reducing the cash flows anticipated to be generated, or the discount rate that's used when you're applying a valuation model? All of those things I think can come in. And on the flip side, if you're a business that really is on top of the ESG, your ESG compliance, then should you get some kind of a benefit from having some additional value added? And I've been seeing that more in terms of just how valuations are done and what the ESG buildup is when you're working through those.
That was actually going to be my next question is, David, how are you seeing this in valuations? Because that's the $1 million question, right? But I love the equivalence to looking at it, thinking about it, that one of the terms you hear a lot is tech debt. So what's the cost if the business hasn't upgraded its technology to go in and do that? Now you think about how that might apply in a supply chain context. So if the business hasn't really gone in, done its due diligence on its supply chain, made sure that it has, suppliers who are acting appropriately, has the right data on that. And when you take over the business, you're going to have to go and do that. You're going to have to invest in the systems and the people. You might have to make changes in your suppliers. You might find surprises that you would not want to find in that. So, having a discount for something along those lines where you go into diligence and you find, hey, this hasn't been done, is a really good idea, because then you're giving yourself cushion to pay for that what will be an expense on down the line. And so I think that's a great way to think of it. And then also the business line opportunities. So it could be, where the business you're acquiring, if you're really aware of what kind of opportunities exist in this space, you might be able to see an opportunity in a business line that the company doesn't. So maybe you'll be able to get a little extra value on that. Or if you're selling, really understand what opportunities you have there, so you can again build it into your pitch deck, into your pricing, into your arguments for the price that you want to support. But yeah, I think that's it. It does need to be built into pricing, and you can look at it from the perspective of, am I buying a clean company that's more plug and play, that isn't going to, require that I go back and fix a lot of things, or am I going to have to fix things? And then what's the business opportunity? Because ultimately, there is a ton of business opportunity in the space. That's why you're seeing, very large valuations for companies that are coming out and in the sustainability space, particularly around climate and greening our economy. Those companies are getting very large valuations because of the need in this space.
Well, we're getting a lot of comments, and if others, if you have questions or comments, I'll try to, look down and see it. But I think generally the comments have, been expressing that they've experienced similar things, whether it's the importance of integration or differences between, maybe a European perspective on ESG in the US. But Christine, you raise a couple things that I want to make sure I cover. One, your point about the diligence aspects of it, where things can go wrong or where there's opportunities. I do think that's an important thing. I can't stand the sort of check the box diligence that I have to say a lot of lawyers do. You have these lengthy checklists and you sort of, and they grow every year because you add more things. And so this would be just another set of things. I think I had sent you one you'd asked for. And as I looked at it, I thought, wow, this will just, it was 10 or 15 pages. It's great because it does give you, things to think about. But again, you have to really think about what's material to your business, what's material to what you anticipate the acquired company to add to your business, and focus that energy. But it can't be a check the box type process in an M&A deal. And because of all of these other factors like reputational risk and other things, it may not be easy to find. So your diligence efforts have to be, even things like just Googling, what's going on, checking social media feeds, doing things that, looking on Reddit or other kinds of things where people are talking about a potential target, and drilling down a little bit deeper to figure out what's really happening with the customers, with the suppliers, with the communities that these businesses are operating in, because there could be hidden risks or opportunities. But if we focus just on the risk side, there could be hidden risks that, the normal diligence checklist or asking, are you in compliance with law, are not going to necessarily ferret out. And so I think when you're thinking about ESG in the M&A context, you have to have a much more holistic view about what the target business is doing in its community, with its employees, with its supply chain, as you mentioned, is a critical one, and what its culture is and attitude toward ESG. Because the other point I wanted to mention, and we've had comments on that, is that integration, Christine, you mentioned, is so important. That is where the value is gained or lost, in an M&A deal. And I almost wonder if you don't have a similar ESG perspective, is it potentially not worth doing the deal? It's not a value. You're not going to extract value from that. But doesn't that show a fundamental disconnect in the culture of the people and what they value? And so can you surmount that as a buyer if you find that a business doesn't share the kind of, perspective that your company has on, let's say the material ESG components?
Yeah. A couple good points in there. So on the diligence, this is a lawyer's favorite topic. We always want to go in and do the diligence and have it considered. And of course, there'll be folks in business development that want to get to a term sheet, and not open up much diligence until after you have, something set. Partially, people don't want to go in and do a lot of diligence because it's expensive before you know whether something's going to float. But there's always that kind of, how much time and how much effort are we going to put into diligence? And absolutely, you're not going to, if the diligence question is, do you comply with law? You're not going to get, what you are going to need on this topic. And for some sellers, they just may not even be aware of the laws in this space. So they may, from a knowledge perspective, answer it in line with their knowledge, and just not know unless you go to a deeper level of questions, really how to respond to that. So it's absolutely a critical issue from a diligence perspective. At the same time, you do have to be, you want to ask the questions, but you need to, find that right balance for the size of the transaction and the complexity of the questions between, how much you're asking for and what you really need. The point on integration is really, I think, very critical. So one of the things that I know my company does when we engage in acquisitions is go in and have fairly extensive conversations about the culture of the company and whether that's a match or closely enough to a match that you can bridge it in terms of an integration effort. And certainly, if you read any studies on M&A, a lot of times, the studies will say, hey, the acquisitions don't live up to the business case, and a lot of times that money is lost in integration. A huge piece of integration is the cultural aspects. And so, for example, if you have a company that's very committed in terms of diversity and takes this is really a core mission, and then you're acquiring a company that really hasn't paid attention to it, how are they going to react when you start wanting them to integrate that into your hiring and your talent development and whatnot? Is that going to become a battleground for you to take on? Or if you're on the selling side and you're really committed to driving down your carbon footprint, maybe you have a footprint, you have a plan, you've made a public commitment. It does become an advantage in terms of hiring talent, so your employees are committed to it, and then you're selling into a company that doesn't share that value, is not going to continue with your commitment. How is that going to work with your leadership? How's that going to work in terms of retention? Will that become a barrier or a reason for employees not to accept the new buyer? So I would put all of that into, not necessarily a separate ESG only lens, but it's one of the many aspects of culture that you would look at to see whether integration will be successful. And also, I cannot see the comments due to my, the last minute phone setup that we figured out here. So if there are comments or questions for me, David, read them off. I'm happy
Yeah,
to.
let me actually throw one
Yeah.
actually from Amir, who's commented a bit. And I
Yeah.
know you'll love this one. But how do you diligence sort of the supply chain, and what do you think? And let's think about it, since we're talking M&A, let's think about it from a buyer who is, let's say, looking at a private company target, but a large one, and that has, let's say, operations, in various places around the world. So how would you go about thinking about that?
Yeah.
One thing is you just get a bunch of contracts. That again would be sort of the check the box sort of way to do it. And people, lawyers or others reading that, may not see anything. The words may be there. There may be, language saying you'll comply with the laws and, various things. But what do you think about in terms of, on an M&A side, diligencing the supply chain and suppliers in a deal?
I think if you're acquiring a company that has an extended supply chain, maybe it's a manufacturing company or a company that, anything in the clothing industry, anything where they're buying a lot of goods from suppliers, you want to understand what are the controls over the supply chain. So the controls will tell you a lot more than the contracts will, even though lawyers like reading contracts. Do they have, any kind of system that regularly collects data on their contracts? Do they have, can they tell you, oh, this contractor accounts for 10% of this kind of good, they're located in this place? Can they give you, data that tells you that they are monitoring their subcontractors? And then going in, you could do a heat map on, okay, where are the most risky areas? So for example, my company uses what's called the Maplecroft Index that tells you, countries that have the highest risk for corruption and human rights violations. And we do different, stress testing based on the kind of level of risk in the country. So you could look at that and say, say, oh, hey, we have a major supplier in a country that has a high level of human rights and corruption issues. Okay, have you done any diligence on that particular supplier? Do you require any reporting from that supplier? Has anyone gone out and visited that site to see what's happening? So I think the story around supply chain isn't as contracts. If you're in a cross-border context and you're dealing with contracts in countries where they are difficult to enforce and so forth, it's you should have them. You should make them as robust as possible, but it's a small part of the overall story.
Yeah, and one thing I'll come back to is, and I talk about this a lot, is the importance of being, proactive as opposed to reactive in M&A. You always have to be kind of anticipating, what's going to happen next? How should I position, this particular issue? How do I, think very holistically about it in the context of what's material to my deal? And every industry, every sector, every business is going to be a bit different. So, and that's why we talked about having a good sense of yourself and your business and where you are right now in your journey and where you want the business to go. But Chad Abood has joined with some lots of comments and generally supportive of what we're talking about. But one of the ones I'd like to mention is the idea from the sell side of sort of positioning things in advance, thinking about where are our strengths and weaknesses? What can I do to minimize the weaknesses and highlight and accentuate the strengths? And if you can do that, I really do think you're going to open yourself up to a whole range of other potential buyers who otherwise might not have looked at your business because it may not fit with the culture and everything else. And with the prevalence of greenwashing claims and other sorts of things about people that are sort of hyping up their ESG standards, it's very important to have that data that sort of underlies that and make sure you ask about that. And when you're thinking about, prepping a business for sale, I would be sort of reverse diligencing yourself and thinking about, okay, what is likely going to be the target areas that a buyer may look at? And what can I do now in maybe the year or 2 years prior to a sale to really help get myself in a position where instead of those are being defensive weaknesses, those are actually strengths that I can push forward. And I think those are going to reflect in the values. So it's actually going to generate value, but it will also make the sale process quicker, which is better, less risk of it going sort of off the rails, and it will make the diligence process on the buy side a lot better. But Christine, I assume that makes sense from the sell side to be thinking in advance. And how 100%. Do private companies do that generally when they're not, they're not subject to some of these regulations that we said or these new disclosure? So how do you think private companies that are thinking about doing a sale should start positioning themselves?
Yeah. Great question. This really applies in both a sale and an IPO context. I think particularly I've heard in an IPO context in industries interesting like Bitcoin mining, where investors really dig deeply into environmental aspects and particularly there's been a lot of news around carbon usage of those businesses, which it wouldn't not necessarily point that out be a natural thought in terms of I don't know how many people are thinking about it at IPO, but certainly when you start preparing, maybe you're 2 years out, maybe you're a year out, companies prepare for a sale or an IPO well in advance. And if you start as part of your kind of scrubbing and your data collection thinking, okay, let's get the data that shows we have these programs in place. Let's in our pitch deck, you're gonna put together a deck. You're gonna send it to some investment bankers. They are gonna either shop it around on an exclusive basis or on an auction basis. Slightly different process for an IPO, but ultimately you're going to have a lot of data that you're providing to suppliers in the first end. So if you can provide that data in the first end saying, hey, we've already done all this. Here's our footprint. Here's our diversity program. Here's how we're, here's our ethical profile. You provide all that, then you're going to be, taking some questions off the table from due diligence, or giving your people a guidebook to say, hey, you get this question, here's the answer. And just showing that, again, that you're a clean and responsible company in that context will be very helpful. And a reminder again, the ESG, this terminology, this thought process has come out of investor questions. It's for investors. And then also insurance has been really interested in these questions. So it's very real if you're getting into a PE context or something like that, to start in your preparations. Because what isn't going to work, I can tell you, is to go out for sale, put out your pitch deck, get into an auction, get the hundreds of questions and diligence, and then say, oh, I don't know. You're not going to at that point be able to generate all of the data that you need in order to answer those questions. So you're going to have to admit you don't know, or you haven't addressed it, because you won't be able to instantly fix it to the point where it will address what the buyer's questions are.
Yeah, it's a terrible place to be.
Yeah.
That's like very scary. If you're representing a seller, and sometimes they are hesitant to spend some of the time and the money to think through some of these issues, but they're just becoming more and more important for companies to look at. And so whether you're on the PE, a potential PE buyer, or you're more of a strategic, people are interested in this, and you're not going to be able to just say, I'm just a private company, I haven't really thought about this. Now, of course, it matters the size and scope of what you're doing and your impact, of course. And so for some, it may not be as significant than other businesses. But overall, I think having that sort of view about what would a buyer anticipate or expect in my business is going to make a big difference, and then try to be responsive to that as you go forward. And I do think some of this will be sort of cleaning house before you get to that IPO, or before you get to that sale process. And Amir asked another question about how that feeds through in valuation. I do think that if you make investments that are going to improve your long-term sustainability, your long-term ESG ratings, compliance, if you're a reputable business that is going to be in for the long term, there are ways that can be essentially recouped. I mean, in my view, I kind of view it as capital improvements, things that you may not get an immediate return from, but the idea of just deferring those and saying, I'm not going to invest in our people, I'm not going to invest in cleaner technology, I'm not going to look at what impact my business is having to the environment, the climate. I'll just foist that on someone else, like a buyer or some other third parties. I just think in the next coming years, and maybe Christine, as a result of some of the things that you said, the climate disclosure in the U.S., the sustainability reporting directives in the EU that are going to touch on private businesses that are in the value chain. All of these things are kind of converging in a way that you're not going to be able to sidestep that, I think, as easily as you might have been, 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago.
You raised a really good point on the EU, and something that I don't think has gotten enough discussion in U.S. legal circles is the CSRD and what the EU has come out with there. I make it equivalent in my mind to GDPR and how Europe drove the privacy issue. So that what it is a requirement of a broader set of disclosures it's not just climate, it's covering a whole range of ESG related issues. And the thing in terms of there's an extraterritorial application where if you are over certain thresholds of business in Europe, and they're not very high, it might be 40 million in sales, or don't quote me on that, but something along those lines, but not very high, that you end up roping in the organization to do these kinds of disclosures. So it's really going to become a requirement for doing business in Europe to have these disclosures, not just if you're European headquartered, but if you're headquartered outside of Europe and selling into that market in a significant way to do. So I don't feel like that is. I've done a post on it. I don't feel like that's really gotten as much a focus as it deserves. It'll certainly take a while to implement within the EU, and there's a time frame to it. But you look at privacy. Europe came out with GDPR, and what was it? It came to actually into effect with companies. I believe it was 2018, but had been enacted before that in the earlier part of the decade. And you think about it now, GDPR is just standard operating procedure for any company that's of a size that's doing anything cross border. In not just in Europe, it's becoming a market expectation, and then here in the U.S. you have the California regulations that have followed that to a large extent. So 2013, I remember doing contracts that most of them did not reference privacy at all, or maybe they said we will follow privacy best practices, full stop. And you think about how that context has changed. I think we're heading in a similar way with some of these corporate sustainability disclosures.
Yeah, definitely. Because and we've talked about that before. It's almost like once you get a framework like that and you're in a global business, do you try to mount a very difficult compliance obligation to just mix and match, and it seems very complicated, so sometimes it's better to just default into GDPR or other things, and the European sustainability directive is going to, I think, lead the way. It's certainly much more substantive and much more detailed than the SEC's proposed climate disclosure. It covers a lot of different areas beyond that, so it's much more expansive. But again, it's a good framework, checklist, I guess I would say, to be thinking about what might I need to do, particularly if I'm in the value chain of some of these businesses. But I guess my overall thinking as we come close to wrapping it up is it's just, I think M&A in particular is going to be really driven by these ESG, factors as we move through this year and really in the next decade for sure. And that, I think, in my mind, is not just the ESG focused ones, but all deals, because it has a significant impact. Whether you are focused on climate or whether you're focused on more of the people factors of ESG. All of that is going to roll into the valuation, the sourcing, how you negotiate deals, and then ultimately how you integrate them in the business. But Christine, I just appreciate so much that your expertise and knowledge about all things ESG. And for anybody who has not followed you, and probably nobody, because you have everybody following you. So it's probably nobody that's on this, but if anybody does not follow you and has any interest at all in ESG related topics, especially if you're in-house, but I read all of it. It's very helpful just in terms of me thinking through that. And you post on a lot of other, great things too, follow you. And I'm just so happy that we're able to do this. Hopefully we can do like a follow-up on some other, topics, whether or not M&A related, but I really appreciate you, deciding to take a chance and do this with me.
Of course, I've been a huge fan of yours from the very beginning, David. I love what you're doing. It's very unique in terms of how much knowledge you share on LinkedIn on M&A transactions is incredible, and much more practical, I must say, than anything I learned in my law school M&A class. So I think it's really good for anybody, not just legal, but businesses as well to read. And, I'll come back and talk with you, anytime about whatever subject. I can talk on many different subjects. Maybe we can discuss your school collection.
Yeah, I should. I mean, I should do a LinkedIn Live with, some of my Air Force Ones.
Yes.
I have a few off camera that I'm not going to show right now, but yeah, I mean, I should do that. And there is, to me, there is a connection to that, because I think in M&A and what you do, you're very creative in thinking about some of, the topics that you write about. And I know you've been into a lot of the visual depictions of things, which are really great for making complicated things more simple. But I think anything that's sort of creative, whether it's, interested in sort of, wearing sneakers and doing M&A, or doing some of these visual depictions, in my mind, makes you better. It makes you more creative, ability to think about things from different ways. So no, I've been very inspired by a lot of the things you've done, and also just your willingness to try new things. Because when I started doing this, you were already way out there on lots of things. But even in that time frame, you've just embraced so many different things, including that visual side, which I'm struggling with. I don't really have in my mind yet how my mind doesn't think that way, but I want to get to that. So you've been very inspiring, I think, in just terms of how you approach, what you do with your company, but then also, all the great things that you do for people on LinkedIn, and super supportive of other people's things, not just your own. So that's been awesome.
All right. Well, thank you so much, David, for having me. And I have big plans for this year for more visuals and more ESG topics. So, definitely would love to have whoever's interested give me a follow.
Yeah, I'm sure they will. I no doubt about that. I keep the videos, the occasional videos coming, the pictures. I like seeing those. So no, it was terrific, Christine. So many great tips and so much value, and people are commenting. Appreciated having you on. So thanks, Christine, and thanks everybody for following me and Christine and participating in these. It's sort of an experiment. We'll see. I don't have anything yet planned for a next one, but I've got a couple of things in mind. So we'll see what happens. But thanks again, Christine. Appreciate you joining. Okay, thanks everybody.